Hello and welcome back to the Wandering Cantos. Today I want to discuss why I believe that Rent-a-Girlfriend is a Shakespearean masterpiece and why its use of cringe is intentionally genius. So, this will be part one in a two-part series. So, in part one, we will discuss how Rent-a-Girlfriend uses cringe to create tension in a very Shakespearean way. And in part two, we'll take a look at how Rent-a-Girlfriend plays with Shakespearean character tropes. So if that sounds interesting, make sure you subscribe so you get notified when part two comes out. Also, I want to give a spoiler warning for Hamlet, Macbeth, Much Ado About Nothing, Romeo and Juliet, The Henriade, and seasons 1 through 4 of Rent-a-Girlfriend. So, why the comparison? Well, first I want to take a moment to explain why I am even comparing Rent-a-Girlfriend and the many plays of William Shakespeare. This isn't just a random attempt at being ridiculous for clickbait. Instead, I am making this comparison because I believe that Rent-a-Girlfriend should be categorized as a Shakespearean sort of comedy romance, not as a classic anime romance. I think a lot of people review Rent-a-Girlfriend as a romance anime and as a result give it low scores. The thing is that's sort of like giving Hereditary a low score because it wasn't funny enough. It's not really fair to judge the show for failing to do something it's not even really attempting. So, the classic anime romance sort of follows more or less a pattern of boy meets girl, boy and girl find themselves in a situation where they must interact. Boy and girl starts to develop feelings for one another, but for some emotional reason, the boy can't confess his feelings. This causes a fight between the two. Through his time with the girl, however, beyond this fight, the boy basically ultimately overcomes his personal issues and prepares himself to confess. And then at some climactic event like a fireworks festival, the boy confesses and the two kiss. The end. So, at first glance, Rent-a-Girlfriend seems to follow this pattern in the beginning. However, the main difference is that Kazuya never quite gets over his personal issues and properly confesses. So you have to ask the question, is this just bad writing? Is Kazuya just being annoying and cringe, or is something deeper going on? I would argue that this series intentionally starts with familiar romance tropes so it can then subvert the audience's expectations as it reveals itself to be more of a Shakespearean plot instead. To prove this point, let's take a look at some of Shakespeare's plays. So, some notable examples of Shakespearean plays. Much Ado About Nothing. Rather than being a standard romance story, this comedy is about two characters who constantly bicker and do not get along, who then suddenly have to pretend to be lovers, which ultimately leads to them falling in love with one another. This is sort of like the enemies to fake lovers to real lovers story. It's a lot like how Kazuya and Chizuru constantly bicker and then are forced to pretend to be boyfriend-girlfriend when around their families. Another example is Richard II. So this one's not a comedy, but is a history play, but in it, one of the central themes is that Richard's indecisiveness is what ultimately leads to his downfall. In Act 1, he holds court to hear accusations of treason, and this quickly turns into a trial by combat, but then this trial by combat is then cancelled, and then it basically ends with both participants becoming exiled, but then the exile is partially lifted for one member who then returns home and dethrones Richard. So similarly, Kazuya constantly fails to commit when he makes up his mind. He will decide to either confess to Chizuru or tell his grandma the truth or break up with Ruka or perform some other sort of form of self-sabotage, only to then go back on everything before any change is able to occur. And then another example would be in Macbeth. So this play is all about Macbeth and Lady Macbeth getting way too caught up in lies. One lie leads to another lie, and every attempt they make to cover up the truth only makes things get more complicated. As things get more complicated, the mental state of both characters continues to deteriorate. These lies lead to basically an intense sense of paranoia, which ultimately leads to their downfall. Similarly, Kazuya and Chizuru are constantly paranoid that someone is going to find out about their fake relationship. They lie to their friends and family. They hide from mommy when she's around and sort of investigating things. They go along with other fake relationships to keep the charade going. And they even lie to Chizuru's grandmother, which is really her only surviving family, as she dies. This last part in particularly, it really feels pretty dark in the moment, and both characters are ultimately very conflicted in their decision to never tell her the truth. And then another example comes from Hamlet. So this is another play that is all about the main character being unable to make up his mind. Basically, Hamlet becomes frozen by indecision due to a fear of consequence. If he seeks revenge, he may be damned for eternity. But if he doesn't seek revenge, he curses his father to an eternity of suffering and also lets the villain get away. This is the play that has that whole famous to be or not to be soliloquy. It's all about sort of indecision and considering multiple options. And this indecision and sort of impulsiveness ultimately leads to Hamlet becoming more and more isolated from his friends and family, and ultimately leads to his demise. At the start of Rent-a-Girlfriend, Kazuya is super close to his family, and he has two really close guy friends. At the end of season 4, however, he is so caught up in his lies and his inability to confront the truth that he feels completely alone. Because ultimately, since he's so indecisive, he also doesn't even have Chizuru, who's the only other person who knows about his lie. And then in Romeo and Juliet, this play is sort of the opposite of Rent-a-Girlfriend, in which Romeo and Juliet are in love, but lying to their parents about it, versus pretending to be dating when in reality they aren't. However, it shares a similar theme to Rent-a-Girlfriend in that it ultimately reflects the idea that lying to your family about your relationships is never a good idea and it will never end well. So, returning to Rent-a-Girlfriend. So, returning to our earlier point about Rent-a-Girlfriend not being a standard romance, the point I want to highlight here is that the audience's entertainment is not supposed to come from those cute aw moments that you might find in a standard romance. Instead, the story relies on the tension found in these flawed characters navigating increasingly complicated situations, which are born of their own flaws. Richard II is entertaining because you get to watch the downfall of an indecisive king. Hamlet is entertaining because you get to witness the agony of an indecisive character struggling to make an impossible choice. Macbeth is entertaining because you get to see the unraveling of a king as he gets caught up in his own lies and his own deceptions. Rent-a-Girlfriend, similarly, is entertaining because you get to watch Kazuya and Chizuru as they struggle to navigate an increasingly complicated situation that was ultimately born from one little lie. So, Rent-a-Girlfriend and Cringe. Now, one of the other main criticisms I see made against Rent-a-Girlfriend is that it's cringe and that Kazuya in general is cringe. My response to this, however, is why is that necessarily a bad thing? I think there's sort of a weird thing going on with this criticism where we have decided that cringe situations in a story equals bad writing. But if you're cringing, doesn't that mean that the story is realistic enough and you are immersed enough in it to be able to find these scenarios cringeworthy? You sort of have to be able to empathize with the character or care about them even a little bit in order to feel secondhand embarrassment for them. But again, I really want to highlight this point. Why have we decided that that is bad writing? So, are Shakespeare's characters cringe? I would say the answer is yes, but let's take a look at some examples. So, Hamlet. Most of Hamlet is just Hamlet pretending / maybe not pretending to be crazy. Literally all of his family and friends are absolutely baffled by his behavior, and he even ends up accidentally killing people and just making a mess of things while pretending to be crazy. It's super cringe, and all of the other characters basically don't know how to react to his extreme behavior. And then in Macbeth goes absolutely crazy at this banquet attended by very important people. And it's not like a cool mad king moment, but instead he causes such a scene that everyone gets quiet and kind of just stares at him in cringing disbelief. He starts yelling at a ghost that no one else can see, and his wife has to berate him and then tell everyone that, oh, well, Macbeth has always sort of suffered from these afflictions ever since he was young, but this excuse that she makes only makes the court judge him even more because they're basically thinking this guy is not fit to be king. And then in Richard II, Richard makes a huge scene while transferring the crown to Henry IV. And this once again can only be described as being really cringe. He thinks that he's basically showing everyone off and getting in the last word, but meanwhile, everyone else is just very uncomfortable and cannot wait for him to be finished. It's actually like high key, a very excruciating scene to get through. If you know, you know. So, why cringe can elevate writing? I would argue that the conflict in plot is only as good as its tension. Basically, if the stakes don't feel high enough and the tension doesn't feel intense enough, it's often not going to be very entertaining. Now, this doesn't mean you need an action movie level countdown in every scene. So for example, however, if you see a random bystander character confess to another random bystander character, you aren't going to be at the edge of your seat. As a result, you won't be crushed if the other character says no, and you won't be cheering and celebrating if they say yes. On the other side of the coin, if you've been following the relationship between two characters for a while and you care deeply about both characters, you're going to be far more invested in their relationship. So if you know how anxious character A is about confessing to character B, you will be all the more worried about a rejection. If you think that character B is actually in love with someone else, you have the extra drama of expecting a reaction or a rejection and then cringe and all of the hurt that will follow this sort of moment. And so there's that anticipation. Therefore, if character B does reject character A, you will feel character A's pain. Similarly, if character B accepts character A's confession, you will be celebrating right alongside character A. Therefore, the anticipated cringe that comes from a fear of rejection is ultimately what keeps you at the edge of your seat. I feel like Rent-A-Girlfriend really leans into this level of high stakes, high tension. If you're cringing away at Kazuya's decisions, that just means that you're immersed and invested enough to feel secondhand embarrassment. If you're flinching while the story gets more complicated and the truth seems all the more about to come out into the open, that means that ultimately you're invested in hoping that that secret isn't revealed. Cringe, in this sense, is actually a highly effective tool for writing. Everyone has experienced being embarrassed or being in a cringy situation, so tapping into that shared experience makes the story all the more relatable. Furthermore, I think that it's kind of fascinating how cringe works in stories. Basically, cringy moments can feel like a punishment for the audience for a character failing in a social setting. Just as we may cry with a character when they fail something or lose something or someone valuable, we can cringe with them when they make a social mistake. In addition to this, it's kind of cool how cringe can be connected to a sort of sense of anticipation. Half of the time, I'm cringing in anticipation of what will happen to the characters, and often the worst case scenario that I'm expecting doesn't even happen. Just as you might recoil in anticipation of something scary during a scene in a horror movie, cringe makes you feel a similar level of engagement, but in a social story. So, yeah, with that being said, that's going to wrap up part 1 of this 2-part series. So, if you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like. Also, if you want to be notified when part 2 comes out, please consider subscribing. But with that being said, I'm going to wrap this one up, so take care, and I will see you in the next one.